The candidates to the stage, Vice President Kamala Harris and President Donald Trump.
Well, it looks like we're only going to have one debate in this presidential campaign for various reasons, because it's been so unusual in that Joe Biden has dropped out and Kamala Harris has dropped in very late in the race. So it looks like there's only going to be one debate between them, which is most unusual. And it'd be interesting to see how much impact it'll have. Now, first of all, the setting that's chosen by ABC. I mean, if you wanted to portray doom and gloom, you couldn't have gone for a better set, really. I mean, the dark, foreboding set, it looks like something out of Game of Thrones or something. There's some sort of chalkboard at the back. I think it's got the Declaration of Independence on it, on a sort of a split screen. But, I mean, it is as dark and as miserable as you could possibly get. So when the candidates come out, I mean, it's silent, miserable, a long way from the sort of the general sort of news debate thing that you're used to, sort of theme tunes, lights flashing, and certainly a bit of stage light. Here, it's very gloomy. Now, the very first moment, it's hard to believe that these two characters haven't met yet, but that's apparently the case. I mean, in decades of both of them being involved in politics, or at least a decade anyway each, that they haven't met is quite unbelievable. And I find it hard to believe, really, that they haven't met at some function. But so the first interaction was always going to be fantastic and interesting. And in this one, I think Kamala Harris's campaign has thought it out far more than Trump's, because she makes a point of going over to shake hands with him. It looks like the format they've chosen, they haven't invited them both to come out and to interact with each other at the start, so they've kind of left that open. And Kamala Harris has made a point of going all the way over to Trump's podium and shaking hands with him. She comes out much sooner. She's faster. She stretches out the hand. Trump is known sometimes to grab the hand and make a very vigorous handshake where he's pulling the person back and forth. He's been known to do that. Not the case here. I think he was probably taken a bit surprised by this. I think that'll be looked on as a minor opening victory for the Kamala Harris campaign right from the start.
Kamala Harris, let's have a good debate.
Nice to see you. Have fun.
Thank you.
Welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you. It's an honor to have you both here tonight.
Good evening. We are looking forward to a spirited and thoughtful debate.
So let's get started. I want to begin tonight with the issue that voters repeatedly say is their #1 issue, and that is the economy and the cost of living in this country. Vice President Harris, you and President Trump were elected 4 years ago, and your opponent on the stage here tonight often asks his supporters, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? When it comes to the economy, do you believe Americans are better off than they were 4 years ago?
So I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America.
From the start, the question is, are people better off than they were 3 years ago at the start of your administration? She dodges the question. She doesn't say yes or no. Interestingly, I mean, the obvious safe response would be to say yes. And there's so many economic indicators that you can pretty much make the case yes or no, depending on whether you look at GDP, whether you look at job rates, whether you look at foreign direct investments, balance of trade, all of those measures, you can probably cobble together some picture that fits both. She's avoided that totally, and she's gone for the opening statement, really. And that's one unusual format about this, is that they haven't invited an opening statement from either candidate. They do a closing statement, but not an opening one. So I think Kamala Harris's team has shoehorned in an opening statement into the first answer. So, and it's all about saying, pitching, I'm middle class and I'm going to help the middle class. Interesting choice in that the key swing states are probably more working class and lower, and they're the ones, the votes that are probably up for grabs. But interestingly that she chose to say that she's middle class, and she's fighting for the middle class there. There's a lot of votes there, but I would have thought probably pitching it a little bit lower might have been more sensible. Just an interesting side point, which I've just thought of now, is that on in the historical annals of these debates, it's been found that by psychologists that the taller of the two candidates has tended to outperform in terms of people's opinion. Maybe because there's a perception that the commander-in-chief or the president would be one who should be tall and strong and able to protect us, and that kind of instinct, regardless of how people might think consciously, unconsciously, they're looking for somebody like that. That's probably not going to be the case in this, because you have the split screen, which is a relatively new thing. You have them both at the same level. So that psychological impact is probably not going to have the same impact. In terms of body language, I think Kamala Harris is certainly performing better in that she's more open. She is looking at Trump far more. She's engaging. She's engaging with the audience as well. Trump is not looking at her, so not tending to engage, and also doesn't seem to be looking at the viewer either. He seems to be looking down at the moderators, which is a terrible mistake. You shouldn't be talking to the moderators. You're supposed to be talking to the people, the voters, the 200 million voters out there that you need to influence. So surprised that there hasn't been a bit more coaching there. The Kamala Harris team has been all over that. They've definitely looked at the body language, all of that sort of thing. The non-verbal communication is much better. Now, it could be improved, I think, and you'll see later there's other points where I think she lets it slip a little bit and lets herself down, but otherwise definitely better than the other one. An interesting aspect to all this is the whole game theory aspect, which I'm sure somebody somewhere is looking at. And there's a lot of research into game theory now and how it affects strategy, for instance, Brexit, European Union expansion, and foreign policy aspects between America and Europe and so on, and other countries. Game theory is a fascinating study of interaction between competing or cooperating bodies, and how much they should compete, how much they should cooperate, and what happens if either chooses a preferred strategy. So and it would be interesting to look at it here. So Kamala really has a number of different strategies. Number one, she can say, well, look, I'm running for president on my own steam as my own independent candidate. I'm a brand new candidate. I'm going to be president on my own, basically, merit. And a lot of that would be trying to dissociate herself with the Biden administration. The second one is to say, well, yes, I'm very proud of the Biden administration, and I'm going to take the strengths of that, and I'm going to work with it, and I'm going to run on my record there. So there's two competing options that she has, and for each of those, then the Trump campaign can attack either one of them. And it's interesting, really, she hasn't mentioned Biden once, as far as I know, so far. And very rarely in the whole debate does she mention Joe Biden at all. So it looks like her campaign is going for the former. Presenting herself as a new candidate, effectively, and as a brand new candidate with new ideas, which is a risk, but it's probably felt that associating herself too much with the previous administration has too much baggage. And let's see.
I believe in the ambition, the aspirations, the dreams of the American people. And that is why I imagine and have actually a plan to build what I call an opportunity economy. Because here's the thing. We know that we have a shortage of homes and housing, and the cost of housing is too expensive for far too many people. We know that young families need support to raise their children, and I intend on extending a tax cut for those families of $6,000, which is the largest child tax credit that we have given in a long time, so that those young families can afford to buy a crib, buy a car seat, buy clothes for their children. My passion, one of them, is small businesses. My mother raised my sister and me, but there was a woman who helped raise us. We call her our second mother. She was a small business owner. I love our small businesses. My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to start up small businesses, knowing they are part of the backbone of America's economy. My opponent, on the other hand, his plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations, which will result in $5 trillion to America's deficit. My opponent has a plan that I call the Trump's sales tax, which would be a 20% tax on everyday goods that you rely on to get through the month. Economists have said that that Trump sales tax would actually result for middle-class families in about $4,000 more a year because of his policies and his ideas about what should be the backs of middle-class people paying for tax cuts for billionaires.
She makes a pretty good pitch there towards small businesses and also entrepreneurship and stuff like that, which is admirable, and it'll probably go down well. And also this tax cut of $6,000 to younger families, a tax credit, I think, is probably more of the type of low-level type giveaway thing that you'd see in Irish politics, which is at a much lower level. So it's interesting to hear that kind of thing. And it's probably the only financial figure that's been mentioned throughout the whole debate. She says the 6,000 tax credit. Now, I mean, the obvious question for Trump to, in a response, is to say, well, this is what you want to do. You want to help small businesses. Well, you're in power. What have you done over the last 4 years? Interestingly, he doesn't make that until the very end. So that is probably, again, a win for Kamala there in terms of lower income, being seen to be on the side of the smaller person rather than Trump being on the side of the billionaires.
President Trump, I'll give you 2 minutes.
First of all, I have no sales tax. That's an incorrect statement. She knows that. We're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world. And the tariff will be substantial in some cases. I took in billions and billions of dollars, as you know, from China. In fact, they never took the tariff off because it was so much money they can't. It would totally destroy everything that they've set out to do. They're taking in billions of dollars from China and other places. They've left the tariffs on.
Interesting response there from Trump. So what he's saying is that it's not a sales tax, it's tariffs on other countries importing goods. So this has been an interesting one, and over the last sort of 20, 30, 50 years, really, economies have tended to open more, and certainly none more so than my own in Ireland, which is a very open economy and relies a lot on foreign direct investment, multinationals and stuff. And America was. Now, Trump reversed that by putting on tariffs on goods, particularly from China, and it would have been looked on as a very regressive step at the time, certainly by economists. However, it's something that's kind of caught on in that the Biden administration retained those tariffs, and in fact the European Union, has actually followed suit in that there was a feeling that a lot of products were being dumped in Europe, sort of solar panels and other things like that from China, and seriously undercutting European industries. So the EU actually followed suit and tried to restrict or put tariffs on goods, particularly from China. So in some ways, he's probably got a valid point on that.
I had tariffs, and yet I had no inflation. Look, we've had a terrible economy because inflation which is really known as a country buster. It breaks up countries. We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before, probably the worst in our nation's history. We were at 21%, but that's being generous because many things are 50, 60, 70, and 80% higher than they were just a few years ago.
The inflation point is sort of an open goal there. The Kamala Harris and Biden administration certainly probably saw historic levels of inflation up to 20%. And now a lot of that was probably beyond their control. It was international effects that led to that. The COVID situation, then the response from COVID, the rebound when markets opened again, and inflation just seemed to go crazy all the way across the world. And particularly the war in Ukraine, the restriction of resources, basic stuff like food from Ukraine being the breadbasket of the world, led to huge inflation in gas, oil, all of those kind of things. That feeds into a topic later. So that is a valid point, probably beyond the responsibility of the administration, but it's probably a point where the Trump campaign are probably going to focus on.
Us. Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Donald Trump left us the worst public health epidemic in a century.
So now a counter-offensive by Harris in relation to unemployment, in relation to economy and the health crisis. Again, much like inflation was probably not the responsibility of the Biden administration, all of those things were probably not responsibility of the Trump administration, because there was a global pandemic which affected everything. So I suppose across both administrations you've got external factors now which led to serious impact on the economy and everything else. But interesting.
What you're going to hear tonight is a detailed and dangerous plan called Project 2025 that the former president intends on implementing if he were elected again.
Difficult to tell with the Project 2025. I'm not sure if that was the right attack route to go on. I mean, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have think tanks that are associated with them that will occasionally come out with sometimes bonkers proposals in terms of what their administration should do in the future. And, you know, there's been allegations that there's been socialist, communist sort of very radical suggestions on the Democrat side, and then Project 2025 on the Republican side. Neither candidates really own either of those. So I'm not sure if that was the right way to go down. Probably true in terms of the stock market. It did reach a record high there. Now, of course, COVID reversed most of those gains. But for the first 3 years, yeah, there certainly was a very, very big rally on the stock market.
When you look at his economic plan, it's all about tax breaks for the richest people. I am offering what I describe as an opportunity economy, and the best economists in our country, if not the world, have reviewed our relative plans for the future of America. What Goldman Sachs has said is that Donald Trump's plan would make the economy worse. Mine would strengthen the economy.
This opportunity economy buzzword that Kamala has brought forward and her team have brought forward is an interesting one, because it sounds like a kind of a conservative right-wing proposal, really, in every respect. It's sort of entrepreneurial, supporting the business side rather than the workers, and it tends to kind of give the impression that rising tide lifts all boats type policy approach, which is an interesting one, because she's trying to outflank Trump on the right, really, in terms of growing businesses and this opportunity economy thing that she's talking about. And it's interesting that she's bringing in all these economists and stuff like that and getting the credit from that, because normally that's something that would be the Republicans' arena, and I think she's trying to do a bit of attack around there, and it seems to be working.
Vice President Harris has argued it'll mean higher prices on gas, food, clothing, medication, arguing it costs the typical family nearly $4,000 a year. Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of tariffs?
They're not going to have higher prices.
That's a pretty leading question by the interviewer, and I'm surprised to hear it. The interviewers should be careful to be completely impartial in the questioning, and it's really a leading question where he says, do you think Americans can afford higher prices because of your tariffs? And it's basically saying, because you've done X, it will automatically lead to Y. So this correlation and causation there, really, it's a fairly leading question. Interesting response from Kamala Harris there, in that it's probably true. He did start a trade war, very controversial at the time. Now, they are snookered, the Harris campaign, in that they did hold on to those China tariffs, and trade is still booming as a result. So that's a little bit of an own goal there, I think.
But what Donald Trump did, let's talk about this, with COVID, is he actually thanked President Xi for what he did during COVID. Look at his tweet. Thank you, President Xi, exclamation point, when we know that Xi was responsible for lacking and not giving us transparency about the origins of COVID.
President.
Now, that's a fairly wounding attack there by Kamala Harris. In effect, sort of turning the tables there on Trump by attacking him and being too kind to China, and claiming that China was responsible for a lot of the outbreak in results of the COVID virus, something that probably the other side would have probably made the case for, but she's actually making it and really turning the tables on there. So that will probably, that's a punch that's landed really.
Well, let's understand how we got here. On October 7, Hamas, a terrorist organization, slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, many of them young people who were simply attending a concert. Women were horribly raped. And so absolutely, I said then, I say now, Israel has a right to defend itself. We would. And how it does so matters, because it is also true, far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed, children, mothers. What we know is that this war must end. It must end immediately, and the way it will end is we need a ceasefire deal and we need the hostages out. And so we will continue to work around the clock on that. Work around the clock, also understanding that we must chart a course for a two-state solution. And in that solution, there must be security for the Israeli people and Israel, and in equal measure for the Palestinians. But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself, in particular as it relates to Iran and any threat that Iran and its proxies pose to Israel.
The foreign policy aspects are interesting because there actually isn't a huge difference between the two in relation to foreign policy. And what Kamala Harris just said there is a continuation of probably 50 years of American foreign policy in relation to Israel. She said, I will always ensure that Israel has the ability to defend themselves. That means basically keeping the tap running with the trillions of dollars that they give to Israel. And also, she made a very strong point about the October the 7th attack and the need to respond to that. So there isn't a huge difference between the two in relation to foreign policy. I think what Trump tries to project is because he's a tough guy, people are afraid to step out of line, that Putin wouldn't have gone into Ukraine, that the Hamas wouldn't have gone into Israel, and who knows, really, almost impossible to know in hindsight what would have happened.
And that is why so many military leaders who you have worked with have told me you are a disgrace. That is why we understand that we have to have a president who is not consistently weak and wrong on national security, including the importance of upholding and respecting in highest regard our military.
So got quite nasty and pretty personal there on both sides. And it's interesting that the foreign policy was what brought that up. But Trump made a jibe about that basically people don't respect Biden and Harris and that she hates Israel, which was a fairly low jab. And I think was probably countered by Harris making a fairly strong commitment to Israel, that she would support them and back them and allow them the means to defend themselves. Harris in return said that many generals that worked with Trump said that he was a disgrace, which was quite a response. And then Trump came back to say that Putin had endorsed Harris, which is just bizarre, really, the whole thing, and a lot of mind games there, and God knows what the strategy there was. But in terms of foreign policy, I think both of them, it's very difficult to compare two, because during the Trump campaign, it was a totally different world. Now to the Harris campaign, there's war on both fronts. Who knows whether they would have started. I suppose Trump is claiming that they wouldn't have started under his presidency and didn't, and he's trying to claim the credit for that. And I suppose it's probably a fairly weak point for the Harris Biden campaign, because both wars, I think, are looked on as being pretty unsuccessful from their point of view. Certainly in the Ukraine, they're losing. The NATO side seems to be losing ground. It seems to be trundling on with no end. And also on the Israeli side, they seem to be on the losing side there as well, in terms of public goodwill and capital and stuff like that. So it's probably a fairly weak point to attack the Biden and Harris campaign.
We're going to do it, and we're going to replace it. But remember this, I inherited Obamacare because Democrats wouldn't change it. They wouldn't vote for it. They were unanimous. They wouldn't vote to change it. If they would have done that, we would have had a much better plan than Obamacare. But the Democrats came up. They wouldn't vote for it. I had a choice to make when I was president. Do I save it and make it as good as it can be, never going to be great, or do I let it rot? And I felt I had an obligation, even though politically it would have been good to just let it rot and let it go away. I decided, and I told my people, the top people, and they're very good people. I have a lot of good people in that administration. We read about the bad ones. We had some real bad ones, too, and so do they. They have really bad ones. The difference is they don't get rid of them. But let me just explain. I had a choice to make. Do I save it and make it as good as it can be, or do I let it rot? And I...
Interesting for Trump to be taking the moral high ground there and saying that he chose the gracious option in accepting the project of a previous administration and allowing it to not allowing it to go to rot, as he says. The truth is, I suppose Obamacare was a massive victory of not just Obama, but Biden, who was the VP at the time. It could be said they've inherited that victory into the current administration, and really healthcare is something that's plagued American policy for decades. And the fact that a victory was secured on that is undoubtable by Obama, and I suppose by reflection, Harris. And it's basically he's not winning any ground by under this. He doesn't have another option, because there really isn't any other option. It's a minefield, and I think he knows that, and I think he's probably lost out quite a bit on that point.
The former president has made. I've made very clear my position on fracking, and then this business about taking everyone's guns away. Tim Walz and I are both gun owners. We're not taking anybody's guns away, so stop.
Oh, another interesting comeback there by Kamala Harris. And again, she's trying to outflank Trump on the right by saying that both herself and Tim Walz are gun owners. So I suppose it's basically trying to be to the right of Trump, if that's possible. An interesting strategy there. And you see that quite a bit with, I think Hillary Clinton tried to be seen going out hunting with a rifle when she was trying to get elected. And it's fascinating, even with all of the controversy about gun control and gun rights, that a Democratic challenger like Kamala Harris will be seen to not only support gun ownership, but is actually a gun owner, and her VP pick is a gun owner as well, in order to just silence the critics on that issue. And really, Trump had no response to it. Interesting about the recalling her support for Bernie Sanders, who would be considered quite a far-left character, his banning of private health insurance. And really, it's one of those glimpses of policies that Kamala Harris has been accused of abandoning now that she's running for president. So there is probably a weak point there, but hasn't been breached yet.
Drug prices, he never did. We did. And now we have capped the cost of insulin at $35 a month. Since I've been vice president, we have capped the cost of prescription medication for seniors at $2,000 a year. And when I am president, we will do that for all people, understanding that the value I bring to this.
Ooh, interesting promise, election promise, if you like, has kind of slipped out there. And I'm not sure if she actually meant it, but she said, okay, they've already capped the prescription cost, annual prescription cost for medicine for $2,000 a year for seniors, which has been achieved. And then she says, when I'm president, we'll do the same for all people. Now, I'm not sure if she actually meant to make that pledge, because that would be probably the most costliest pledge, I would say, in American history. Given the price of prescription drugs in America, where people pay 20, 30, 50 grand sometimes for medication, I'd imagine that bill landing on the federal government would be enormous. Now, if she meant it, it would be something that maybe should be a lot more of a headline associated. It seemed to be more of a throwaway remark at the end, but quite a costly one.
And I am proud that as vice president over the last 4 years, we have invested $1 trillion in a clean energy economy, while we have also increased domestic gas production.
The climate change one is a fairly fraught one because the debate is happening in Pennsylvania, which is the key swing state for both of them. So it's felt that Kamala Harris cannot win the election without getting Pennsylvania. And probably true in the other direction as well. And Pennsylvania has a lot of fracking, which Kamala Harris has said previously that she is opposed to fracking, and she would, in fact, I think she said she was definitely opposed to fracking. Now she has shifted her opinion on it, I think probably because of that political expediency. And that is a kind of a weak point for her, I think, in terms of energy. I think Trump probably has the edge on energy in that during his campaign, there was open season on fracking. It led to a lot of domestic gas and suppressed gas prices and energy prices in America, which probably led to very low inflation. As he says, inflation was negligible or zero, probably about 1%. Under the Biden-Harris campaign, it's probably it hit about 20%. Again, probably not due to circumstances under their control, but it's certainly a weak point on that side. So the fracking is something that is a fairly sensitive issue. Some environmentalists hate it. Others are probably in favour of it because it displaces probably less environmentally damaging fuels such as coal and stuff like that. So gas is the friendliest and the least damaging fossil fuel. So if you can frack the gas, then you're getting it where you need it, and you're also probably displacing some coal use, maybe some oil use as well. The other side of it is that fracking causes a lot of local environmental damage and disrupts the landscape. It can lead to fairly serious sort of disruption and impact in terms of these giant pods, which are where the earth is fairly scorched. So there are sides, both sides. There are two sides to that story. I suppose it's a crucial one in Pennsylvania where there is a lot of fracking, but the issue is, I suppose, again, down to where do you get your energy? Do you import it from Russia in terms of gas and oil, or do you get it locally through fracking if necessary? The closing statements then are interesting because and Donald Trump opted to go second, and by the looks of it, he opted to go second in order to try and rubbish everything that Harris had said, which is what he pretty much did. I was expecting Harris to go more for the kind of painting the vision of what her presidency would be like in 4 years. She didn't really go for that. She tended to go a bit more prosaic on it. And I suppose that's probably a legacy of the fact that he is sort of in power at the moment and didn't want to promise too much. And she's probably shackled with the fact that she is part of the Biden administration. In all of this, there's the elephant in the room, which was mentioned once, but the fact that Biden is still technically president. I mean, he wasn't really mentioned much in the debate, but it's kind of strange to think that he is actually president at the moment, and nobody really knows what he's doing. Nobody really knows who's in charge. Is it Kamala Harris or not? And that's an issue for her as well. She has to kind of resolve that in some way. Does she take responsibility for being effectively the de facto president, or does she not? So I would say overall, I mean, the debate was fairly uneventful and fairly prosaic. I was expecting a bit more vision from Harris and expecting a bit more life and vigor from Trump. Neither really presented themselves. I think there was fairly cagey. Maybe both felt it was their debate to lose. It's so tight that maybe they went in a fairly neutral sort of approach to it in order to not lose the debate effectively.